We're going to talk about employment law, but we're going to start with the aspect that employment is actually riddled with a huge amount of regulations. You have laws, you have rules, you have regulations, you have best practices, you have a whole series of things that really is, in theory, if you do it well, based upon a philosophy of treating your potential employees with dignity and respect, a philosophy of making certain that when they step out of line, you apply the law appropriately in each individual situation. So we'll talk about all the different aspects, but first of all, you're going to find that this class, like most other college classes, you'll be actually dealing with the aspect of here are some of the rules and the definitions you must know to successfully pass this class. Yes, I'm going to do exactly the same thing. That is part of the process of learning the academia. So let's first of all talk about the regulatory environment. Really, it's the aspect of the freedom to contract. It's crucial to marketplace freedom. That is what makes our country specifically different than an awful lot of country. Now, that right is also have a series of regulations to make certain that a person walking in the front door gets equitable treatment, and there's really an agreement that you have. It's really an exchange of, you give me part of your life here and give me that time over here, then I will give you money. I will give you benefits. I will give you some sense of security in your life. Don't give it to me, and then I'll probably pull this back from you. Really, an employee may choose to work or not to work for a given employer. But with that freedom comes a certain responsibility of contract fulfillment, and there is a contract in the aspect of employment with certain obligations, and promises are made on both parts, and you have all that. But for the most part, you really are an at-will employee in almost every single situation. If you look on a national basis in the United States, right now, we really have the aspect that less than 10% of all employees are unionized. And whether that's good or that's bad in the process, you'll see though that the aspect of being of you not hiring or not owning the job is very rare, except in California, of course. But if you look at California on a national basis in the ranking from 1 to 50, okay, with 1 being the best place to run a business and 50 being the worst place, California actually ranks at 50. Okay, so, but in California, public employees have a thing called property rights. So as we go through the course, you'll see that I'll talk about everything on a national basis, but I may get more specific and give you some extra tidbits in regards to California, because that's really the focal point of this class, although it will certainly hopefully be able to learn the knowledge base in other parts of the country as well. The laws are designed to protect workers' rights. Here you go with some of the basic laws that you're going to have to know, and we'll talk about them more in detail. I'm going to give you a preview of some of the major laws that we have across the United States. The Fair Labor Standards Act, that defines our wages and overtime pay. So, the federal law is that after 80 hours, if you work in a job over a 2-week period, then you get paid overtime. Now, that can vary, just depends how you're doing, if you have an employment contract or an employment agreement. But for the most part, people normally pay overtime after 40 hours a week. But actually, federal law says overtime after 80 over a 2-week period. That can change depending upon the circumstances. OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Act. You should know this. It's a matter of protecting employees. There are certain things that have to happen. You might have an OSHA inspector show up on the job site if you have a problem. If you've been foolish enough to sit down there and paint over a broken curb and somebody trips on that curb, you may have a problem. And so we'll talk about the aspect of what the Safety and Health Act, what that really is. And in California, we have something similar, okay, and we'll talk about the differences between federal and actually state law. We also have a thing called the Family Medical Leave Act, which provides unpaid leave for family or emergency situations. And there's a lot of merit to that. I know it drives some employers crazy, except for the fact that every once in a while you'll have the aspect of somebody has a crisis and needs to get away and hopefully not lose their job. It's too bad too many people abuse situations like that. If something good turns into something bad when it's abused. ADA. Just so you know, this is a law that was passed back in the 80s, and really at the core of it is one of the most expensive mandates in the history of the United States. A lot of people went crazy over the different aspects of the ADA, Americans Disability Act, but the issue really came down to equity. If you happened to be in a wheelchair and you pulled up to a corner of a normal street, you had to cope with the aspect of your front wheels going off the edge of the curb, slamming 4 feet down onto the pavement. And if life was good, it didn't fall your wheelchair and smash your head against the pavement. Then you had to cope with the back wheels. Not only that, then you had to cope with going across the street and hopefully nobody hit you, and then going up the other side. Figure that one out. We had that prior to that, and you'll see now we've had a lot of different things over the last 50 years where people have gone through. They put ramps on a lot of different streets. They changed the door frames. Do you realize that in a wheelchair, your typical reach of a wheelchair is about 29 inches from edge of a wheelchair to the other edge, and a door used to be 32 inches. So you try to get through a doorway and you could rip your skin trying to get through. And it sounds different, but the ADA addressed a lot of these small issues that made life so much more livable for a large number of people. It's phenomenal. And you know what? All of us hope to live to be old. We'll talk about this in the aspect of what that means. EO. 1964, we passed what's called the Civil Rights Act. We also codified it into law. We called it Title VII. Now, put this in your notes. Whenever you see a Roman numeral law, it's typically a federal law. If you see an Arabic number, that'll be a state law. So typically Roman numerals are reserved for use in federal laws. So Title VII deals with EEO, and here are the 6 different categories, and they've added a couple, and we'll talk about what they are. What genetic information? Yes, some people are discriminating based on genetic information. We'll talk about that aspect later on. The NLRA, the National Labor Relations Act, this helped establish the National Labor Relations Board, and we'll talk about what that means and how it has an impact on a lot of employers that give the employees the right to unionize and to organize unions without being discriminated against. Now, here in California, of course, we're special because we are California. We have the California Fair Employment Housing Act. You know what? It looks almost just like the Civil Rights Act. Okay, except for the fact that you add a couple things that are the California twist. Whenever you have a federal law will always dominate state law. If there's a conflict between them, federal law wins. It's called the United States of America. If there's a conflict, you might have different aspects of it, and the conflict really comes down to that you can have the state can expand upon a federal law. So for instance, you have the Fair Employment Housing Act. There are some features, it is exactly have the same regulations as the federal, but it expands upon them. That's legal. If it tried to contract on it, it would be an illegal act. So you have that. The California Labor Code. The federal code is $7.25 for a minimum wage. California is $16.50. Oh, and if you are working in the fast food industry, yes, that's obviously a high skill industry. Our state legislator increased that wage up to $20 an hour. And normally, when I mentioned before, on a federal level for overtime payment, if you work more than 80 hours over a 2-week period, you have to be paid overtime. Nope, not in California. We have a better system according to our state legislator. If you work more than 8 hours in a day, you get paid time and a half in that aspect over there. We also have the Healthy Workplace, Healthy Family Act, where in essence you accumulate 1 hour of paid sick leave for every 30 hours of work. We have really the instead of the FMLA in California, we have both the FMLA, Family Medical Leave Act, and we have the California Families Rights Act. It's very similar. It just expands upon the federal law. Instead of OSHA, we have Cal-OSHA. It ensures workplace safety, and it has us go one step more than what the federal is. And we also have some laws about whistleblower protection. So we'll talk more about that later on. Generally, we talk about regulation of employment. We're talking about the fact that you don't have a legal right to your job. It means that once you're hired, your employer may choose to fire you, even for reasons that seem unjustified, as long as it's not in violation of a contract or one of the few bases discussed in the textbook. But basically, there's far more reasons the boss can fire you than not. That makes you feel real secure, doesn't it? So that being said, as an employer, you may fire someone. I thought I would toss in this image of fire burning on the side just for entertainment purposes about firing somebody. Anyway, so you may terminate somebody simply because you don't get along with them. It really is the aspect of the employer determines whether or not who is in the workforce and who isn't it, provided they're not acting on a discriminatory basis in violation of the laws that we'll be talking about. In essence, our regulatory environment, it consumes a massive amount of energy and resources. A lot of times you may have somebody coming in and they want to fire somebody because of this. I've had situations where somebody came into my office and I questioned them. You just gave this person a positive memo and then copied the personnel file. So I'm going to put this in the personnel file, but wasn't it last year you wanted to fire them? Well, I'm trying to give them motivation. Don't do that. Don't do that. But I want to motivate them. And then they put another one in the file. And then finally, the third memo, they wanted to fire them. Excuse me. So now you've given a good evaluation, 2 positive memos, and now you want me to fire them. I'm sorry. You need to pay attention to what you're doing. You're not doing a good job. When it comes to employment law, you'll have people coming to you with issues like that on the outside, you shake your head and wonder, what are you thinking in the process? That you will consume a large amount of energy and resources in trying to figure out which pathway to go and making certain you're saying the same thing consistently as an employer. A lot of times, this is the turf of the human resource department, but let me make it clear to you, no, it's not. It is the turf of every single person who wants to wear that title of leader. If you're a leader, you must know a lot of the material we're going to cover in this class. It's hard work. Of all the decisions that you'll make in the employment place, okay, it's always nice to be the one that brings the donuts and everything else and passes that around and everybody's happy. When you have to pass around a layoff memo, it's a different thing than passing out donuts. When you want to sit down and say your work is not up to par, and if you don't do it, things will happen, maybe leading up to your termination. That's not a pleasant conversation. We'll talk about that in the aspect of making certain it complies with regulations, but also maybe about the attitude and spin that you want to have in that process. Regardless, it's imperative that we treat people with dignity at all times. Looking forward to the rest of this chapter. Take care.